The monitor flatlined at 2 in the morning, and the sound cut through the emergency room like a knife through silence. A young woman in her late 20s lay motionless on the gurney, her skin already turning a shade of purple that made even the most experienced nurses look away. 22 doctors and nurses had rotated through that room in the past 9 minutes, each one trying something different, each one failing. In the hallway just beyond the glass partition, a man in a navy dark janitor's uniform stood frozen, his mop still dripping water onto the linoleum floor. His knuckles had gone white around the handle. When he whispered the word "stop," it came out like muscle memory, like something his body remembered before his mind could catch up. A young resident spun around exhausted and defensive. "You're a janitor. Stay out of this." But something in the way the man held himself, something in the deliberate stillness of his gaze made a few people in that hallway pause and look twice. His name was Ethan Ward, and most people at Metropolitan General knew almost nothing about him beyond the fact that he worked the overnight shift and kept to himself. He was 36 years old, broad-shouldered, but not bulky, with the kind of quiet presence that made him easy to overlook until you really looked at him. The janitor uniform hung a little loose on his frame, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows out of habit. His hands were calloused and steady, the hands of someone who had done more than push a mop for a living. Before he became a janitor, before he started taking the overnight shifts that no one else wanted, Ethan Ward had been a combat medic in the United States Army. He had served 2 tours in places where the name of the country mattered less than the color of the sand and the sound of helicopters overhead. He had learned to patch up wounds in the back of moving vehicles, to make life or death decisions, with nothing but a headlamp and a prayer to stay calm when everything around him was falling apart. He had been good at it, too good enough that his commanding officers had pushed him to apply for advanced medical training, to consider staying in and making it a career. But then something had happened, something he did not talk about, and when he came home different. The official paperwork called it post-traumatic stress. Ethan called it penance. He had a daughter now, a 7-year-old named Avery, with bright eyes and a smile that could light up a room even when the lights were already on. She was small for her age, a little too thin, the kind of kid who got winded running around the playground, but never complained about it. Ethan had custody, full custody, because her mother had left when Avery was still in diapers and never looked back. It was just the two of them in a 1-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city, the kind of building where the heat worked most of the time, and the neighbors knew better than to ask too many questions. Ethan worked nights because the pay was slightly better, and because it meant he could be home during the day when Avery got back from school. He would sleep in shifts a few hours here and there, and sometimes he would wake up disoriented, unsure if the sounds he heard were his daughter playing in the next room or the echo of something from a desert half a world away. The rent was always due, and the medical bills for Avery's checkups were always more than he expected, and so Ethan took every shift he could get and never asked for help. He had learned a long time ago that asking for help meant admitting you could not handle things on your own, and he could not afford that kind of admission. The other janitors and orderlies liked him well enough in the way people like someone who does their job and does not cause trouble. They did not know about the Army, did not know that he still woke up some nights drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced he could hear someone calling for a medic in the dark. They did not know that he had stopped practicing medicine because of a mistake, or what he believed was a mistake, a moment when he had been 1 second too slow, and a good man had died because of it. The guilt had followed him home, had settled into his chest like a weight he could not shake, and eventually he had made a decision. He would leave the medical field entirely, would find work that kept his hands busy and his mind quiet, would never again put himself in a position where someone's life depended on his judgment. It was better that way, he told himself. Safer. He had become a janitor not because he lacked options, but because he needed the kind of work that did not ask him to be a hero. Avery did not know, most of this not yet. She knew her daddy worked at a hospital, knew he came home smelling like disinfectant, and sometimes brought her little packs of graham crackers from the vending machines. She knew he was quiet and gentle, and that he always made time to help her with her homework, even when his eyes were red from lack of sleep. She had asked him once why he did not work as a doctor, and he had told her as simply as he could that he used to help people in a different way, but now he helped by keeping things clean and safe. She had accepted that answer the way children accept most things, without pressing too hard, and Ethan had been grateful. That night, the night everything changed, had started like any other. Ethan had clocked in at 11, exchanged nods with the evening shift supervisor, and begun his rounds on the third floor. By 1 in the morning, he had made his way down to the emergency department, where the pace was always unpredictable and the floors always needed attention. He had been mopping near the supply closet when the commotion started, when the double doors burst open and a team of paramedics rushed in with a young woman on a stretcher, her body limp and unresponsive. Ethan had stepped back out of the way, as he always did, and watched as the organized chaos of emergency medicine unfolded around him. He had seen it before many times, and usually he could tune it out, could focus on his work, and let the doctors and nurses do theirs. But something about this case pulled at him, some detail he could not quite name. Maybe it was the way her skin had already started to change color, or the frantic edge in the lead physician's voice, or the fact that he could tell even from a distance that the standard protocols were not working. He had stayed in the hallway, mop in hand, and tried to ignore the familiar tightness in his chest, the old instincts that told him exactly what needed to be done and exactly why he could not be the one to do it. Avery was asleep in the break room, curled up on the old couch with her backpack as a pillow because the babysitter had canceled last minute and Ethan had no other options. She had insisted she was fine, that she liked the hospital at night, that it was like an adventure. He had made her promise to stay put, to not wander, and she had given him that smile and promised. The emergency room had a rhythm to it, a kind of controlled chaos that most people learn to navigate after a few shifts. But tonight the rhythm was off. Ethan could hear it in the raised voices, in the too long pauses between instructions, in the way the monitor kept flatlining no matter what they tried. He knew even without being in the room that they were losing her, and he knew with the kind of certainty that came from experience rather than hope that they were missing something critical, something that would not show up on a standard emergency protocol checklist. He had seen injuries like this before in places where the nearest hospital was hours away, and the only thing standing between a soldier and death was a medic with a field kit and steady hands. He had learned techniques that were not taught in civilian medical schools, improvised procedures that worked when nothing else did. He had saved lives with those techniques, and he had also failed to save lives, and the memory of both haunted him in equal measure. So he stood in the hallway gripping his mop and told himself it was not his place, that he had walked away from this world for a reason that interfering would only make things worse. But the sound of that monitor, that endless, flat tone, was louder than any argument he could make to himself. Inside the trauma bay, the situation was deteriorating faster than anyone wanted to admit. The attending physician, a man in his early 50s with silver hair and a reputation for staying calm under pressure, was starting to show cracks in his composure. He had called for the defibrillator twice and already had administered epinephrine, had checked and rechecked the airway, and still there was nothing. The woman's heart had stopped, and no matter what they did, it refused to start again. Around him, the team was beginning to fracture. A young nurse had tears streaming down her face, though she was still performing compressions with mechanical precision. An intern stood frozen near the crash cart, eyes wide and useless. Another doctor, a woman with close-cropped hair and a stethoscope hanging around her neck, was checking the medication log for the third time, as if the answer might suddenly appear there. They had been at this for 9 minutes, which in emergency medicine was both an eternity and no time at all. Every second that passed without a heartbeat reduced the chances of survival, reduced the likelihood that even if they did bring her back, she would be anything more than a body kept alive by machines. The attending knew this, everyone in the room knew this, but no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Ethan could see all of this through the glass. He could see the exhaustion in their movements, the desperation creeping in around the edges. He could see the way they were following the protocols exactly as they had been taught, and he could see that the protocols were not enough. His hands tightened on the mop handle, and he felt the old familiar pull, the one that said he could help, that he should help, that standing by and doing nothing was its own kind of failure. He had spent years trying to silence that voice, trying to convince himself that he had made the right choice in walking away. But tonight it was louder than it had been in a long time. A young resident, a woman who could not have been more than a year out of medical school, stumbled out of the trauma bay, her face pale and her hands shaking. She was muttering something under her breath, a string of medical terms that Ethan recognized even from a distance. She was second-guessing herself, running through everything they had tried, searching for the missing piece. And in that moment, with the monitor still screaming its flat tone and the clock ticking past the 10-minute mark, Ethan felt something inside him shift. It was not a conscious decision, not a moment of clarity or sudden courage. It was more like a dam breaking a wall he had built to keep himself safe, finally crumbling under the weight of what he was watching. He set the mop down carefully and took a step toward the trauma bay. His heart was pounding and his mouth was dry, but his hands were steady. They had always been steady even when everything else was falling apart. The young resident nearly collided with him as she rushed back toward the supply room, her eyes fixed on the floor, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Ethan reached out on instinct, steadying her before she could lose her balance on the damp floor. She looked up at him, startled, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He could see the fear in her eyes, the kind of raw, unfiltered panic that came from watching someone die and not knowing how to stop it. And then, without fully understanding why, Ethan heard himself ask, "Have they tried cardiac decompression?" His voice was quiet, almost hesitant, as if he was not sure he had the right to ask. The resident blinked at him, confusion flickering across her face. "What?" Ethan swallowed, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "Cardiac decompression. If there's internal bleeding or pressure on the heart, standard CPR won't work. You need to relieve the pressure first." The resident stared at him, and he could see the gears turning in her mind, see her trying to reconcile the question with the fact that it was coming from a man in a janitor's uniform. "How do you know that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "I was a medic," he said finally, "in a different life." For a moment, the hallway seemed to hold its breath. The resident looked at him, really looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. She did not ask for his credentials, did not demand proof or question his authority. She just nodded once and turned back toward the trauma bay. "Come with me," she said. And before Ethan could second-guess himself, before the old fears could creep back in and tell him all the reasons this was a bad idea, he followed her. The trauma bay was louder than he expected, a cacophony of voices and alarms and the rhythmic thud of compressions. The attending physician looked up as they entered, his face a mask of frustration and exhaustion. "Dr. Patel, we don't have time for—" he started, but the resident cut him off. "He knows something," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "He thinks we're missing something." The attending's eyes flicked to Ethan, taking in the uniform, the mop bucket still visible through the doorway, the utter absurdity of the situation. "We don't take orders from a janitor," he said, the words sharp and dismissive. But even as he said it, Ethan could see the doubt creeping in, the awareness that they were out of options and out of time. Ethan stepped closer to the gurney, his eyes moving over the woman's body with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from years of training. He noted the discoloration of her skin, the subtle asymmetry in her chest, the way her ribs seemed to sit just slightly wrong. He had seen this before, had dealt with it in conditions far worse than a fully equipped emergency room. "Stop compressions," he said, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the noise. A nurse looked at him like he had lost his mind, but the attending held up a hand, signaling for them to pause. Ethan leaned in, his fingers moving gently over the woman's rib cage, feeling for the telltale signs of internal pressure. "She's got a tension pneumothorax or pericardial effusion, maybe both. You're pumping her chest, but the pressure's not letting the heart refill. You need to decompress before you can restart." He looked up, meeting the attending's gaze. "I need a needle, a large bore catheter, and oxygen at 100%, and I need it now." The room was silent for a beat, and then another. Ethan could feel every eye on him, could feel the weight of their skepticism and their desperation in equal measure. And then the attending nodded just once, and the room exploded into motion. Ethan's hands moved with a precision that surprised even him, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought left off. He positioned himself at the woman's side, his fingers finding the exact spot between her ribs where the needle needed to go. It was a procedure he had done dozens of times in the field, but never here, never in a place with bright lights and clean floors and people watching his every move. He could feel the pressure of their stares, the weight of their doubt, but he pushed it all aside and focused on the task in front of him. The needle went in smooth and steady, angled just right, and for a moment there was nothing. And then he felt it, the sudden give, the release of pressure that confirmed what he had suspected. Air hissed out, and the woman's chest seemed to shift, to settle into a more natural position. "Restart compressions," Ethan said, his voice steady, "and get ready to shock her again." The team moved without hesitation this time, their earlier skepticism replaced by something closer to hope. The nurse resumed compressions, and the attending charged the defibrillator. his hands no longer shaking. Ethan stepped back, giving them room, his own hands trembling now that the immediate crisis had passed. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, could feel the old fear creeping back in, whispering that he had overstepped, that he had no right to be here, that he was going to fail, just like he had failed before. The monitor beeped once, a single blip that made everyone in the room freeze. And then it beeped again and again, a slow, unsteady rhythm that was the most beautiful sound Ethan had heard in years. The woman's heart was beating. It was weak, erratic, but it was there. The attending stared at the monitor, then at Ethan, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief. "How did you do that?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the sudden flurry of activity as the team worked to stabilize her. Ethan looked down at his hands at the faint tremor that he could not quite control. "She wasn't gone," he said quietly. "You just weren't looking at the right signs." The room erupted into controlled chaos as they worked to secure her airway, to adjust the oxygen, to monitor her vitals and make sure the fragile heartbeat held. Ethan backed toward the door, suddenly aware of how out of place he was, how many rules he had just broken. But before he could slip out, the resident caught his arm. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and then he turned and walked back into the hallway, back to the mop bucket and the world he had chosen for himself. He had barely made it 10 steps before the double doors at the far end of the hallway burst open. A man in a military uniform strode through, his bearing unmistakable, even from a distance. He was in his early 60s, gray-haired and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without asking for it. The stars on his uniform caught the fluorescent light, 4 of them, marking him as a general in the United States Army. Behind him came a small entourage, aides and security personnel, who moved with the practiced efficiency of people used to following orders. The general's face was a mask of controlled emotion, but Ethan could see the fear beneath it, the kind of fear that only came from loving someone and knowing they might be lost. The attending physician met him at the nurse's station, and there was a brief, hushed conversation that Ethan could not hear. He saw the general's expression shift, saw the disbelief, the confusion, the sharp, sudden focus. And then the general turned and looked directly at him, and Ethan felt his stomach drop. The general crossed the hallway in long, purposeful strides, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face. Up close, he was even more imposing, a man who had spent a lifetime in command and who carried that authority like a second skin. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over Ethan's uniform, the name tag that read Ward, the mop bucket, still sitting where Ethan had left it. "They tell me you saved my daughter's life," the general said, his voice low and measured. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He had not known who the woman was, had not stopped to ask about her family or her background. He had just seen someone dying and acted on instinct. "I did what I could, sir," he said finally, the old military formality creeping back into his voice without conscious thought. The general's eyes narrowed, and Ethan could see him putting the pieces together the way a trained officer could read a situation in seconds. "Name, soldier," the general said, and it was not a request. Ethan straightened his body, responding to the command even as his mind rebelled against it. "Ethan Ward, sir, but I'm not a soldier anymore." The general studied him for a long moment, and Ethan could feel the weight of that scrutiny, the sense that this man saw more than most people did. "No," the general said quietly, "but you were, and a damn good one, I'd wager." Before Ethan could respond, there was a commotion from the waiting area, a small voice calling out that cut through the tension like a bell. "Daddy?" Avery appeared around the corner, her hair mussed from sleep, her eyes wide and worried. She must have woken up and come looking for him, must have sensed that something was wrong. Ethan felt his chest tighten, felt the weight of the past hour crashing down on him all at once. He knelt down as she ran to him, catching her in a hug that was probably too tight, but that he could not bring himself to loosen. "I'm here, sweetheart," he murmured into her hair. "I'm right here." The general watched this exchange with an expression Ethan could not quite read, something softer than the military hardness, but no less intense. Around them, the emergency room had gone quiet, doctors and nurses and orderlies, all pausing in their work to witness this strange, unlikely scene. A janitor who had saved a life, a general who had come to reclaim his daughter, a little girl who had no idea that her father had just done something extraordinary. Ethan pulled back, brushing a strand of hair from Avery's face, and when he looked up, the general was still watching him. "I want to see the footage," the general said, addressing the attending physician who had followed him over. I want to see exactly what happened in that room. The security office was small and cramped, filled with monitors that showed every corner of the hospital in grainy black and white. Ethan stood in the back, Avery clinging to his hand, as the general and the attending physician reviewed the footage from the trauma bay. Ethan did not need to watch. He knew what they would see, knew the moment when he had stepped in, the moment when everything had changed. He could hear the murmur of their conversation, the general's sharp questions, and the attending's halting answers. And then the general turned his expression unreadable and gestured for Ethan to come closer. That technique you used, the general said, pointing at the screen, where Ethan's past self was positioning the needle with steady hands. That's not standard civilian protocol. That's field medicine's special operations level. Where did you learn that? Ethan felt the old instinct to deflect, to minimize, to avoid drawing attention to himself. But there was no point in lying, not now, not with the evidence right there on the screen. I was a combat medic, sir. 2 tours. I learned it in places where we didn't have the luxury of waiting for backup. The general nodded slowly as if confirming something he had already suspected. And yet, here you are mopping floors. It was not quite a question, but Ethan answered anyway. I left the service, sir. I had my reasons. The attending physician stepped forward, his earlier hostility replaced by something closer to shame. I owe you an apology, he said, his voice stiff and formal. I was out of line earlier. You saved that woman's life, and I should have listened. Ethan shook his head. You were doing your job. I was out of place. But even as he said it, he knew it was not entirely true. He had not been out of place. He had been exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he had been trained to do. The general crossed his arms, his gaze still fixed on Ethan. My daughter has a rare cardiac condition, something most emergency physicians wouldn't recognize immediately. You did. How? Ethan thought back to the woman on the gurney, to the subtle signs he had picked up without fully realizing it. I saw a case like hers once overseas, a soldier with an underlying condition that got worse under stress. The symptoms were similar. And the general was quiet for a long moment, and then he held out his hand. I'd like to thank you properly, Mr. Ward. What you did tonight, most people wouldn't have had the skill or the courage. I'd like to arrange some kind of recognition, a commendation, something. Ethan looked at the offered hand, at the stars on the uniform, at the earnest gratitude in the general's eyes. And then he shook his head. I appreciate it, sir, but no, I only did what had to be done. In the days that followed, Ethan tried to return to his routine, to slip back into the quiet anonymity of the night shift. But the hospital had changed, or maybe he had changed, and nothing felt quite the same. Nurses nodded to him in the hallways, doctors stopped to thank him, and the attending physician had personally apologized twice more each time, with a little more sincerity. An internal review board had been convened to examine the case, to understand what had gone wrong in the initial resuscitation and what had gone right when Ethan stepped in. They had pulled his service records, had confirmed his training and his experience, and had discovered that the woman's condition was indeed rare, something that most civilian physicians would not have encountered in their entire careers. The general had returned twice to check on his daughter, and both times he had sought Ethan out, had engaged him in conversations that felt less like debriefings and more like the kind of talk that happened between soldiers who understood each other without needing to explain too much. And then on the third visit, the general had made an offer. The hospital wanted to bring Ethan back into emergency medicine, wanted to offer him a position as a paramedic or an emergency response consultant. The pay would be better, the work more meaningful, and they would work with him to get any certifications or licenses he might need. It was an opportunity that most people would have jumped at a chance to return to the work he had been trained for to use his skills in a way that mattered. But Ethan had said no. He had thanked them, had acknowledged the generosity of the offer, but he had explained as best as he could why he had left medicine in the first place. He told them about the soldier he had failed to save, about the guilt that had followed him home, about the nights when he still woke up, convinced he could have done more, could have been faster, could have made a different choice. He told them that he had walked away not because he lacked skill, but because he could not carry the weight of that responsibility anymore, could not put himself in a position where one mistake could cost a life. The general had listened without interrupting, and when Ethan finished, he had nodded slowly. I understand, he said, but I think you're wrong about something. You think you failed that soldier, but from what I've seen, I'd bet everything I have that you did more for him than anyone else could have. And I think maybe it's time you stop punishing yourself for being human." Ethan did not have an answer for that, did not know how to reconcile the general's words with the guilt that had lived inside him for so long. But the general was not finished. "I have a proposition for you," he said. "Come with me to Fort Bragg, to the base where you were stationed. Meet with some of the people you served with. Get some closure, if you can. And then if you still want to walk away, I'll respect that. But give yourself a chance to see that you're not the failure you think you are." Ethan had tried to refuse, had insisted that revisiting the past would not change anything. But Avery, who had been listening from the doorway, had spoken up in that small, clear voice of hers. "Daddy," she said, "maybe it's time you let yourself heal too." And in that moment, with his daughter's words echoing in his ears and the general's offer hanging in the air, Ethan had felt something shift inside him. It was not hope, not quite, but it was something close, a crack in the armor he had built around himself. So he had agreed, had taken a few days off work, had made arrangements for Avery to stay with a neighbor, and had driven with the general to the base that he had once called home. The drive was long and quiet, the landscape shifting from city to countryside, from the familiar to the half-remembered. Ethan had not been back to Fort Bragg since his discharge, had avoided it, deliberately afraid of what it might bring up. But as they pulled through the gates, as he saw the familiar buildings and the soldiers moving with purpose across the grounds, he felt not fear but a strange aching nostalgia. The general had arranged for Ethan to meet with his old unit, or what was left of it. Some had moved on, transferred to other bases, or left the service entirely. But a handful remained, and they gathered in a small conference room that smelled like coffee and old carpet. Ethan recognized faces, names, voices that he had not heard in years. They greeted him with handshakes and rough hugs, with the kind of easy camaraderie that only came from shared experience. And then one by one they told him their stories. They told him about the lives he had saved, about the injuries he had treated, about the times when his skill and his calm had been the difference between survival and tragedy. They told him about the soldier he thought he had failed, the one whose death had driven him away from medicine. They told him that the man had been hit by shrapnel in a way that no medic, no matter how skilled, could have fixed. They told him that Ethan had kept him alive long enough for him to say goodbye to his family over a satellite phone, that he had given that soldier a gift that most people never got. They told him that he was a hero, not because he had never failed, but because he had tried when others would have given up. Ethan listened, and as he listened, he felt something inside him begin to unravel. It was not a sudden release, not a dramatic moment of clarity, but a slow, steady loosening of the knot that had lived in his chest for years. He thought about Avery, about the life he had built for her, about the nights when he came home exhausted, but still found the energy to read her a story or help her with her math homework. He thought about the woman in the emergency room, about the way her heart had started beating again under his hands, about the general's gratitude and the attending physician's apology. He thought about all the people he had helped in ways large and small, and he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had been too hard on himself. Maybe walking away had been the right choice at the time, but maybe it was also time to stop running. The general had stayed in the background during the meeting, but as the others began to filter out, he approached Ethan with a quiet confidence. "So," he said, "what do you think?" Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past begin to lift just a little. "I think," he said slowly, "that I might be ready to try again. Not the same way, not full-time, but maybe there's a way I can help without losing myself in it." The general smiled, a rare expression that softened the hard lines of his face. "I think that sounds like a good plan. And for what it's worth, I think you're going to be great at it." Ethan returned to the hospital a week later, not as a janitor, but as an emergency response specialist working the night shift. It was a hybrid role, something the administration had created specifically for him, a position that allowed him to assist in critical cases without carrying the full burden of primary care. He would still clean, would still keep the floors safe and the halls quiet, but when the alarms went off, when the monitors flatlined, and the protocols failed, he would be there. He would step in with the skills he had spent years trying to forget, and he would do what he did best. Avery had been thrilled when he told her, had thrown her arms around him, and told him she was proud, that she always knew he was a hero, even when he did not believe it himself. And Ethan, for the first time in a long time, had allowed himself to believe that maybe she was right. The woman he had saved, the general's daughter, woke up 3 days after the incident. Her recovery was slow, complicated by the underlying condition that had caused the cardiac arrest in the first place, but she was alive, and she was going to stay that way. When she was strong enough, the general brought her to meet Ethan. She was pale and tired, with dark circles under her eyes and an IV still taped to her arm, but she smiled when she saw him. "Did you save me?" she asked, her voice weak but clear. Ethan hesitated, searching for the right words. "You fought," he said finally. "I just helped." She reached out her hand, trembling slightly, and Ethan took it gently. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving up." The general stood beside his daughter's bed, his hand resting on her shoulder, and when he looked at Ethan, there was a depth of gratitude in his eyes that words could not capture. "I don't know how to repay you," the general said. Ethan shook his head. "You already have, sir. You gave me a chance to remember who I used to be. That's more than enough." A few days later, Avery came to visit him at work, the way she sometimes did when he had a shorter shift. She brought her homework and a thermos of hot chocolate that she had made herself, mostly milk and only a little cocoa, but Ethan drank it and told her it was perfect. They sat together in the break room, and she asked him about his new job, about the people he was helping. "Do they know you're a hero, Daddy?" she asked, her eyes bright with pride. Ethan ruffled her hair, a gesture that always made her laugh. "I'm not a hero, sweetheart. I'm just your dad." But Avery shook her head, stubborn and certain in the way only children could be. "No," she said firmly. "You're a hero, and I'm loud for you so everyone knows it." Ethan pulled her into a hug, feeling the warmth of her small body against his chest, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his past begin to lift. He thought about the soldier he had lost, about the years of guilt and self-imposed exile, about the night when he had stepped back into the work he was meant to do. He thought about the general's words, about the chance to heal, about the life he was building for Avery and for himself. And he realized that maybe redemption was not about erasing the past or proving that he had never failed. Maybe it was about accepting that he was human, that he had done his best, and that his best was enough. The emergency room was quiet that night, a rare lull in the chaos that usually defined the overnight shift. Ethan moved through the halls with a mop in one hand and a radio clipped to his belt, ready to respond if the call came. He paused near the trauma bay where it had all happened, where a young woman's heart had stopped and started again under his hands. The room was empty now, clean and waiting for the next crisis, and Ethan felt a sense of peace that he had not felt in a long time. He was not the same man who had walked away from medicine all those years ago, broken and haunted, and convinced that he had nothing left to give. He was not the soldier who had carried the weight of every loss like a stone around his neck. He was Ethan Ward, a single father and an emergency response specialist, a man who had learned that healing was not just about saving lives, but about allowing yourself to be saved. He thought about the name tag that now hung beside his janitor's uniform in his locker, the one that read Emergency Response Specialist in bold letters. He thought about the people he would help, the lives he might save, the second chances he would give and receive. And as he turned to continue his rounds, he felt the ghost of a smile cross his face. Maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was supposed to be.